Web Platform Podcast, episode number 95. Woohoo!
95.
We're getting up there.
We're getting old in the podcast world.
Today we're going to be talking about JavaScript at scale, so exploring JavaScript at scale. On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Amal Hussein.
Hi, everyone.
And I'm your host, Eric Isaacson. And our guest today is Sean Fiorito. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience?
Yeah. So let's see. I'm 33 now, and I've been programming since I was 12. So I've been a programmer for a long time. I'm a nerd. I think I'm actually wearing I'm wearing a Millennium Falcon T-shirt. So I enjoy
the finest the finest of the Star Wars apparel.
Yes. Actually, I just found this T-shirt. I was pretty excited about it. So then, like, the bulk of my experience is, so I've been programming professionally for 10 years. I do Python and JavaScript. I'd say most of that time I was working for big corporations. Last couple years I've been doing my own thing, doing consulting and writing books and doing training for other JavaScript developers.
That's awesome. Originally, I think I found you through some CSS tutorials that you had done via that one book you had done, the CSS sketchbook, I think, is it?
Yeah, it's called Sketching with CSS. That's actually more for web designers than and web designers who are kind of starting to code. So that's
it's pretty heavy for web designers, I thought, though.
Yeah, well, so web designers. There's kind of this whole movement and need, honestly, for web designers to start writing code, and so they've got this big bridge to get across. So that's what the book is for. It's basically kind of core fundamental tools you need to do some basic front-end stuff as a designer. And yeah, I guess it's pretty heavy, but it's pretty focused too, so it's kind of fundamental stuff.
No, it was good stuff. So today we're talking about large scale, so large scale applications, JavaScript at scale. So that's sort of a very vague term when we talk about web development. So can we kind of refine and define the large-scale web application for purposes of discussion today?
Yeah, I mean, if I could sort of chime in on that, I would say for me, at least the thing I'm more interested in talking about is not so much large-scale in terms of performance and traffic and these things, but large-scale in terms of complexity of code base, which can equal, and usually does, lines of code. So big, gigantic lines of code, and also the other complexity is team members and size of team, experience of team, and these things. And so how do those things play together?
So typically, what are the types of what are the types of companies or people who build these applications, and what do the applications kind of look like? Because it sounds like you're talking about large teams in general, larger than half a dozen, I would say, on a team. So can you kind of give us an idea of the range of this sort of team?
Yeah, I mean, so we could. So there's definitely different sort of groups. So there's, on the one hand, you've got your Amazon, Facebook, Google, and that size of thing. So that's both. Those are both technical. Those are technical companies with software products, and so this is their core competency, and they're writing gigantic code bases. So that's one thing. I guess we all know a lot of software companies like GitHub, and I would put them into that category. And then there's this other category of big companies. Software is not a core part of their business, but they find themselves needing to write gigantic code bases, and that's pretty common for big enterprise companies trying to figure out how to build web applications that help them sell more widgets or whatever it is that they do. So I don't know. It's, for me, I'm more interested in that. It's kind of a more interesting challenge to figure out what are good best practices for software developers in that environment versus in an environment like Facebook or Google or Amazon, where in theory this is their core competence. I guess not even Amazon's not even. I don't know. They're basically a software company, so I guess we can include them. But where it kind of feels like cheating, where you've got it's all developers, and so you can um, and that's all that you're doing. So of course you're going to start with a better like foundation versus, well, I don't know, like some of the companies I'm thinking of, like most of their code is written in COBOL, like this kind of thing, right? So it's a harder challenge to figure out how to how to work with that and in that kind of environment.
Well, and complexity
So,
comes out of not necessarily huge teams, but just the age of products, right?
Also, this, yes,
You
absolutely.
look at things like COBOL or older systems that have been brought up, right? They generally they don't start huge, they start rather small. But over time, complexities and growth occur, and then all of a sudden you have large-scale projects or products that are being shipped, and that can be problematic, right? I mean, teams at that point, all of a sudden now, not only are you scaling your code base, but you're also dealing with the pains of not planning to scale that code base.
Right. Big legacy burden. So that's another challenge that's interesting to try and deal with.
so I guess, is it fair to say that this is a somewhat of a newer problem, new relative to how long people have been writing for the web, with JavaScript frameworks, and then obviously JavaScript frameworks aging so quickly. Angular 1x is now legacy code for a lot of people, so typically. I think John Papa's style guide when it came out for Angular was awesome, but I really think we almost need a new vision of what a style guide or what application architecture means when you're writing for the client in JavaScript, and that's somewhat agnostic to the framework. And so I guess, have you seen any good resources for that?
No, not at all. And I think it's because like the phase that we're in right now is JavaScript developers. Rather than write a style guide, they're creating frameworks which sort of bake in the style into the framework. And in fact, when I hear a lot of people say, like, because I wrote a blog post a little while about why JavaScript development is crazy, and I was basically saying most people don't need a framework, and that's sort of a shocking thing to say, but I really think that. And when the most common thing that I hear back from people as like an objection is, well, then like a framework is useful because it keeps everybody on the same page, like everybody's speaking the same language and everybody's doing the same thing. And so this goes to what I was saying, which is like people are relying on a framework to these things, which traditionally what we could have relied on in the past was design patterns, comments, documentation, sort of traditional things. So I think maybe we're leaning on our frameworks a little bit too much for what you're talking about.
It's a double-edged sword too, though, because you have like very opinionated frameworks. They do something a certain way, and so then you get this consistency in your code base. But then you don't have people thinking outside of that little box that they're in.
It's even rougher, actually. I think one of the big problems is then you end up having to figure out, okay, so how do I do this in Angular, or how do I do this with React, or how do I, when you probably already know how to do it if you weren't trying to do it like the Angular way. So I actually see, like, when a framework is used incorrectly for a project, common symptom is people spending 30%, 40% of their time trying to figure out and thinking about how to do it like the Angular way or the React way, or right, and so like that's a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted money. Like if you're a business that's paying somebody to do this, and then so like I think that if you do like a cost benefit analysis when you're like deciding when to do these things, this is one of those things where most of the time that's not actually. It's not actually worth spending all the time trying to figure out how to do it this way. And then you end up, in Angular 1.x, and that fork has like, no. Then you have no idea. Now you spent all this time making it the Angular way, and now it's dead. And now you have no idea where it's going. And now you have to redo everything to Angular 2, which is just different enough to be a pain in the ass.
Yeah, it's
sorry, guys. I forgot about the rule.
It's definitely a pain. So I mean, we have a lot of wild, wild west out there still. Even though we have frameworks like Angular 2, we have React as a just a view layer, and then you have so many different other pieces you can use with React. There's no like quite standard for that. So, I mean, how do you justify that like time to market? So a lot of companies, they'll be like, well, we got to get stuff out quick. Just use a framework, get it out there, versus like maintaining the code. And as a developer, I think we all agree, do it the right way. But sometimes things happen, and it's hard to really justify that unless you can talk with the powers that be and explain this is why we're going to do this.
So I don't actually necessarily agree with do it the right way as the right answer all the time. So I'll come back to that later, but that's basically a result of me like running my own business and being a consultant for other businesses with software development and seeing like that doesn't necessarily always make the most sense as an investment of time or money for a customer. But the and the other comment that you made was choosing a framework to get something done more quickly, which I think is not almost ever true. Like unless it's something that you're already very, very familiar with. But most of the time, I mean, right? So like a lot of people are choosing frameworks because this is what they want to learn right now, because this is what everybody's doing right now, and so you're using a thing that you've never used before, and just wasting a bunch of time learning how to use this new thing.
Well, I've seen people. Go ahead.
Well, sorry.
So, okay, so
you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Can we also just make a distinction here, because I think there's a big difference between frameworks and libraries, right? So, I mean, a lot of people have solved really hard problems for us, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And this is what the world of NPM is all about, right? Taking things, and just kind of building up like a Lego on other people's good solutions, and so I think there is a difference here, and I think it's clear, like we should kind of make a distinction here for our listeners. Frameworks are, like Angular are maybe a little bit, they come with too much maybe of a pattern, or they kind of bake you into too much of a, doing things in a certain way that maybe doesn't allow for more flexibility over time or over maybe years of maintaining a project. Versus, I think, like using a library to, I don't know, do a regex, parsing, that's completely different, right? And so, can you maybe just elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. So, so I wouldn't so for example, on the project that I'm working on right now, we're doing this. I needed drag and drop functionality, so I pulled out a library called Dragula, and we're using that. That's obviously I'm not going to waste my time if I don't have to reinventing another drag and drop library, right? But that's different. That's restricted to one small piece of how I'm programming. So, and in a way, it's kind of a microcosm of using a framework, because when I pick a tool like this, then I have to do it the way that they have it set up for me, right? And I've got limitations with their configuration. So it's not totally custom, but there's this trade-off. So trade-off in the flexibility of what I'm doing. Versus it's already done for me and we don't have to do it. And I think that the framework, you're also making that trade-off, but at a much bigger scale, right? So, and I think it does start to make sense to make that trade-off, to try and start forcing people in a company and a team to be doing things in a certain way. In certain situations, like very, very big teams, very, very fast-moving code bases, especially at companies where software is their core competence, I think it gets not as clear in different situations whether that makes sense or not. But it definitely has its place. But it's like a big trade-off and constraint. And this is where we get back to what I was saying earlier about when you're working with a framework, the big thing that you run into is, at least for me, and what I've seen at other clients, is everybody's spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do it the way that the framework is doing it. So it's a trade-off.
There was a quote a few years back, I remember. I think it was Ryan Florence who said this. He said, if you're not using a framework, you're building your own. Something to that degree. And I think that can be true if it's not wrangled and and like you said, choose the right tool for the right job, something small, something simple. And as most people know, Justin and I are pretty big web component proponents. So systems of components in general, and doing the approach of like atomic design for me has been very interesting. And I'm trying to not use frameworks. I'm trying to use native APIs and do JavaScript and as little framework stuff as possible. But I find that I am creating mix-ins and helpers. Do you find that that's like dealing with things in systems of components, is that like an anti-pattern for certain types of applications, or does it scale well for a lot of these complex projects, do you think?
So yes and no. So like one thing I've discovered with so before there were web components or that idea, like at a place I worked for, they had something they called them, oh gosh, I got to remember, web parts, I think. But whatever, companies always have this idea where they have like their idea for dividing up code is to basically break it up by like user interface piece, right? So you look at a piece of interface and then like that becomes the reusable thing that you can drop in over and over again. So I guess call it widgets or whatever. Yeah, so that's a pretty common way to break up big reusable pieces. I think it breaks down a little bit because it's super useful for the people in the business that aren't technical, because they can all of a sudden like see the thing that you're talking about, that you're implementing, and they could sort of visualize how it could be reused in different parts of their website. So that's super useful. I think then the problem is because they don't understand, like they still don't understand deeply enough the technical implementation and the like implications of doing things a certain way. So like what I've discovered is when you start doing that, it's hard for people to see the smaller reusable pieces, and so it ends up getting bigger and bigger.
Absolutely.
And so you end up with like your web component or web part or whatever that's like almost not reusable because it's like such a gigantic thing. So it's not an anti-pattern. It's certainly useful, but it's real hard to get it right when you're working with non-technical people.
I think that was my experience when I first started using components years ago. I'm like, oh, I just want to shove everything into this one component because I'm going to use this in like 3 spots. And you don't think about it. Well, if you make these pieces smaller and more composable,
exactly.
It just makes it so easy.
But composable is an idea that's easy for us to understand, but not so easy for your the business people on your team, the non-technical people on your team, your product managers, your project managers. And so that's where that breaks down to me, because it's like gives this illusion of everybody being able to sort of like talk about the technical pieces.
Yeah.
But it breaks down pretty fast because thinking about things as composable pieces is much harder.
Yeah, it's definitely you have to really balance it well, because there's this focus on meetings and planning and documentation. We have to make sure all of our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted. And so it can be very paralyzing in larger systems, for lack of a better term.
Right.
So I mean, coming up with approaches where you keep in mind those business requirements, I've found is very useful. Showing well, this particular feature we need to prioritize, not because I'm a developer and I'm squeaking my wheels, but because this is going to impact our system this way. It's going to provide this much value, and we've proven that out with a prototype or metrics or whatever it is. Have you encountered this paralyzation in corporate America or larger companies, and what have you done kind of to work with that?
Yeah, totally. So, one problem I see a lot is, okay, we finish up a project, and then they see these pieces of the page that are, and assume that it's automatically going to be reusable for the next thing that they're doing, even though, I know that technically
it's just HTML, right?
Right, exactly. So helping people understand the actual scope of work within this web component approach is a challenge. But then I think the way to cut through a lot of stuff and a lot of the risk you mentioned already, which is prototyping, really rapid prototyping, and that's definitely the tool that I go to when I'm trying to sort of show a concept to a client real quickly, and get something functional and working that, sort of like gets the gist of what I'm saying we could do, what the possibilities are, and that cuts through a lot of the paralysis.
Yeah, I feel pressure already on me just talking about it.
To do the prototyping?
Oh, not just the generally sitting in meetings all day.
Oh yeah.
Thinking, oh my God, I need to get back to my computer. I need to start getting to work on some of this stuff because sprint's almost over.
Yeah.
Well, and this goes to the fact of, sort of the culture within organizations that have to scale products, though, isn't it? I mean, if you have your engineering resources or your developers sitting in meetings that should be a business analyst job to be taking requirements or sprint items in a stack, then you've got a breakdown or you have a cultural gap, right? I mean, because at that point, you're not scaling anymore. You're actually creating bottlenecks within your process to deliver features to end users or whomever the people who want your stacks are. So regardless of whether it's for the web or some internal OS or whatever you're working on, at the end of the day, culture plays a significant part in that, doesn't it?
Culture always wins, always. And it's very, I'm very lucky here where I am now. The culture here is very, at Carfax we do pair programming. It's very open. Like you can talk about pretty much anything with the product team. So I haven't been in places that have been like that before. So it's kind of nice to have that.
Yeah. How involved are you in like business outcomes? Like
much more than I used to be here, because at least.
Do you like that? Does that help you shape your programming decisions?
Yeah, because I don't understand the core business as well as a lot of the people in that room, and to understand how they view the project, because we're all working towards the same goal. We're working towards building these products, and everybody wants the same thing. It's just the details are different. So what details are important for those people that I'm working with? I want to know so that we can make a better product and we can push it out quicker. Because if we're not communicating, we're going to be in more meetings and more meetings.
Yeah, ultimately it feels like, developers knowing the context of the product decisions always helps make better decisions in terms of the application architecture. But circling this back to JavaScript, guys, so what are some good practices that, I guess who's doing it right, and what are some good practices that you can recommend for, uber large JavaScript applications, for large teams that, have deadlines and live in the context of reality? So.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I actually kind of liked where we were going a little bit with where the conversation was, where we were talking about like programmers knowing more about like the business outcome and being more involved in that versus like another approach where you have business analysts who that's their responsibility then to just like feed down technical requirements to programmers.
I'm a fan of cutting the middleman as well.
Right.
Well, it depends on your structure and how everybody works together, though.
Yeah, and business analyst, I mean, for large products, like a business analyst is gold. Like,
yeah,
from a I want to write code standpoint, because there's a significant difference, I think, and people I think have a tendency to forget this when they're in smaller teams, because you end up with cross-functional teams that have people who do multiple roles within a stack, and for them that's exciting. But when you get into large products that have redundancy systems and like things that can't crash, like business analysts can sort of protect you from having to deal with fighting groups. So if you have two divisional operations that are saying, here are my features and here's my features, and the vice president comes in and says, you get half your budget.
Oh my God!
You don't want to be the engineer in charge of that. Your BA and your architect are going to sit there, stare at each other, and go, batten down the hatches. It's about to get rough, and then they're going to sort that out. And I'm not to say that engineers can't know what's going on or developers can't know what's going on, because then you don't necessarily get the feature fit you want. But a lot of times I get this a lot from younger folks. Well, just let me talk to them directly. That's fine. but be prepared for some very uncomfortable conversations that may or may not occur.
Yeah, you need a lot of empathy and understanding in trying to put yourself in, their positions. I found.
I think that's something that probably all developers could use more of. So Mal, to take this and circle it back to what you're saying, is like companies that are who's doing it right. So I can tell a little story of a company I think that's doing it right, mostly. Worked at a place. It's called McMaster-Carr. They're a big catalog company. It's an industrial supply company. Either people have never heard of them or they think they're awesome.
Oh,
so.
McMaster-Carr is fantastic. I buy so much stuff from them for the office.
Yeah,
we buy our industrial stuff from them. Yeah, they're great.
I was there last week. Yeah, no, I'm just an innate nodder, so just like nodding.
Yeah, so but it's true that most people either have never heard of it or think it's really like their favorite place for ordering basically literally any random part that you could imagine, and it's usually there that same day or next day. So I was there for about 5 years working on their website, and that's basically where I worked on. I did most of my I got most of my big JavaScript web application experience there. So they did a ton of things that were totally weird and really, really interesting and really, really good. First thing they did was that is totally strange. Is they never hired experienced developers. I was the only one that they hired that was on their web team for the 5 years that I was there. So it was very rare for them to hire an experienced developer, and usually they hired people straight out of college with liberal arts degrees from a select batch of colleges. They picked, fancy colleges that they really liked. So they've got some smart people, and then the role that they offered them was, I forget exactly what they called it, but it was like systems manager or something like that. And then they come to work, and they're given projects that they have to work on, where they have a lot of responsibility. It was a very small team for that website. That's a big company. I can't say numbers because they're super private about it, but they're really big and insanely profitable. And a company that big would normally have probably 10 times the size of developers that McMaster did. So they had a very light team, pretty bare bones. Maybe at the most I saw there were 30 people working on the website at any given time. The whole systems department is, and they're so private I have to be careful about numbers. But anyway, so that was their very small team relative, and plus totally inexperienced. But they all had responsibility for the business outcomes of their project. So each project was pretty small, but it would have a big impact on the business. So maybe project team was small, projects would be big. So 3 people, 4 people, and you kind of work on these things usually they take all year. So the side effect of this was they made decisions about code that were less about the code and more about the business value and getting their project done. They weren't tied up thinking about what's the best possible way to do this with code. They didn't know about best practices or anything like this, so they weren't stuck worrying about it. And so as a result, they delivered a lot of value using extremely antiquated systems. They used version control from the 80s. They had, you just have no idea the things that that they were dealing with there. But because everybody was so focused on their project and just getting something that was going to be useful to customers, they delivered a ton of value in that department to that company. So this is the thing where when I was there, I was always like, you guys, why aren't we using Angular? Because that had kind of come out right around then. It was getting to the point where the JavaScript code base was really, really hairy, really, really nasty, really, really big. Still probably is. And it was maybe it would make sense for us to at least everybody kind of does things that in the same way. They had a framework idea that they used, but it was pretty loose, and it was pretty high level, and it still kind of let people go off the rails whenever they wanted. But so the thing that I had to realize there was, okay, we're not actually doing things the best possible way. Sometimes it's even a little inefficient, and we could be doing things faster. But when I actually look at their results, like they got stuff done faster than most companies that I ever worked for. They got stuff done that was more valuable than other companies that I worked for with like a fraction of the number of people with no programming experience. So I have to take that experience and say, like, what's more valuable? Is it like our programming experience, or is it like being more connected to the business outcomes of what we're doing?
When you think about delivering products and services, though, too, I mean, you look at it from that perspective, the business value is what the users are going to care about. They don't care that you used Angular for the application or, you know, Ember or whatever. They just want to see the results. They want it fast, they want it secure, they want it performant, right?
Right.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It seems like at the end of the day, your customers don't know what you used, and what matters to them is, you know, are their problems solved, and can they use this software in an easy way to accomplish X, Y, Z? Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's still a tool, right? And so, you know, that's pretty amazing, actually, and really refreshing to hear that. So,
I would imagine at that company that you were at, though, that it would be hard to get new people onboarded, like to hire people, because they, like, if the stuff is too old, right? I would think that it would be harder to find people who understand those technologies. Like you were saying, version control from the 80s, right? Things like that.
Yeah, well, version control from the 80s is pretty easy to understand. I mean, there's not much to it. And in fact, like their deployment process for until like the last year that I was there was like print out a piece of paper with all the files that you need to have moved and give it to Ed, and then he moves it over on Thursday night. And if it's a really big one, you stay there and buy him some donuts or something and help him get through it. Deploy. Dude, and they make a lot of money. I mean, I know you sound like this sounds like a rinky-dink operation. It's not. It's a really big.
MasterCard is huge. Their catalog is, if you ever want, I mean, do look at the website. The catalog is absolutely amazing, and it's used a lot in industry. Like I know our plants and industrial places use them all the time.
And they solve really hard user experience problems with the number of products that you have to get through. And it's not like Amazon where you're just buying like a coffee pot. It's like you're buying, you know, hex nuts for your Apache helicopter or whatever. So you need to get the exact right kind. So they solve real hard problems for people.
That's awesome.
And yeah, so like that's not to say that there's no value in a framework, but I think that we really got to question ourselves when we're saying like that it's going to like that this is the only way is to use a framework, or that anybody that's not doing that is stupid, or you know. Which is kind of the feel that I get, and it's been driving me crazy the last year or so of listening to this. When I'm like I have this experience which is the exact opposite end of this. Of course, there's lots of frustrating things and tons of bugs, and the code was terrible, very hard to maintain, and they didn't have. I wish they had more tests,
but frameworks don't necessarily resolve that either. I mean, I've seen lots of products built on top of frameworks that are horrible, like because they didn't understand the framework.
Exactly.
So I think it is. I think it's a question of understanding what you're doing, which is, if you're a developer writing code for features, that's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin is the architect or the engineer who's going to sit there and go, here is the pattern we're going to use. It may use a framework, it may not use a framework. But that sort of definition sometimes doesn't happen at the beginning of larger projects because they don't start large. They start with, hey, my team that is, 20 people needs this little tool that does this thing. And then someone from the other team in the other building goes, wow, I really like that. Can we use that too? And then it starts to grow from there. And all of a sudden, now a tool that started with 20 is now used by 20,000 people. Now all of a sudden you have a scale problem where, oh, wow, I have a huge feature list. And wait, what was my pattern again? And wait, did we use a framework or not use a framework?
Yeah,
but none of those things.
Sprint mode.
Well, yeah. Then it's just it's a mad dash, right? Of like, well, great. Now I have to sort this and that. And then you're right. If you don't have a strategy, if you don't have some means to say, this is what we're gonna do, everyone get on board, you're gonna find yourself in real trouble. Or you're gonna find yourself piecemealed into sort of something that works.
So along those lines, it's kind of like one of my rules of thumb is it's not. And this is again something I learned at McMaster, because even though we had people that had never programmed, they really thought really hard about their programming and like how they were going to design the thing and what they were going to do. And so even though the things they came up with were not what I would usually expect. Like I was always surprised because I would always come up with like the way I'm going to do it, and it's probably the way that you guys do it because we're experienced programmers, and that's what I've come up with. But they would come up with surprising things, but it was really well thought through, and everything had a reason. So, and because there was thought and reason behind each one of those decisions, the code base, even though some parts were a disaster, overall you could pretty much figure out what the thought was behind it, and then when you needed to go do something later, as long as you figured out what they were thinking, which is usually the case because they actually bothered to think it through, you could figure out how to like add your thing or make a change or do that. So, and it was also a lot easier to talk about things at higher level meetings because they had like an idea in their mind of how the whole thing was going to work, and so everybody would understand that, versus like kind of making it up as you go along or like leaning on a framework and saying. So that's more important to me than the framework is actually or like using something like a very common design pattern. It's actually more important to actually just have a thought, like have it completely thought through what you're actually doing. That's the most important thing for a code base.
Thinking is hard, you know.
To totally nerd out on that, though.
So actually, oh, I'm sorry, you're making a joke. No? Okay. All right. So it seems like you're kind of more alluding to like a systems approach to software, right? So systems thinking and as well as feature-driven development, right? So it's kind of like a hybrid of like systems thinking, feature-driven development, get it done, and don't kind of go into analysis paralysis mode with frameworks or how to do it the best way according to such and such person from the internet. I think that's also very liberating, and I think the Google engineers seem to kind of be a bit on your bandwagon because there's the whole hashtag use the platform, right? And so, which kind of caused a little bit of a rage online because, a lot of people were like, hey, frameworks are awesome and they've solved a lot of really big problems for people, and, that sounds like it's a little insulting to just say hashtag use the platform. So I guess maybe what are some thoughts on use the platform movement?
Okay, I don't know what that is actually.
Oh, that's okay. It's
What is it? When they say use the platform, are they talking about like use
no frameworks?
Yes, no framework.
Yeah, no frameworks.
Okay,
like
I am familiar with this.
Use the browser APIs, use all this stuff that's extensible because the web is now an extensible manifesto and things are
I'm very familiar with this. So the problem I think is not the problem is a gap in education and learning. So yes, frameworks solve problems for people. It's because people don't know what problems they solve for them. Like it's okay, Angular, good example. Angular does a lot of stuff for you, which is pretty sweet. Like this separation of the view from your model, right? And in JavaScript, this kind of a relatively new idea or thought. Like usually, and actually, this is one of my sort of rules for bigger JavaScript applications, and it's kind of a no-brainer now, but it's something I learned at my other jobs was like the most important thing, the more complicated it gets, is to not store data in the DOM, like no state in the DOM. That's the most important thing for staying sane. And Angular gives you that, right? So that's one of these things that Angular gives you, and if you're not experienced, you don't even know that you're getting that benefit from Angular. The other thing it gives you is so this idea of dependency injection. Dependency injection is like just a software design pattern which people have been using for a long time. So this is not so like you just are. The difference here is that so Google developers can say use the platform, or whoever's saying this. People can say use the platform because they're coming from the standpoint of knowing all of these other things that you get with frameworks. But then beginners are going to feel pretty uncomfortable with that, and I feel bad for beginners in that situation where it's like, where do I start? And this is why like CSS frameworks are the same thing. Like you don't know how to get the layout on your page, so then you pick like Bootstrap and Foundation, and next thing you know, you're using this giant thing which is solving like these two problems for you, but it's actually like bloated, way more than you need, over-engineered. And that's why actually I think that most Java.
The new people starting, I totally agree with that because they're coming in, and if they get hired for a junior position or whatever, right, or even an intern position, they're going to be working with a framework probably, right? So they have like several abstractions on top of the DOM, and so they'll understand how to fix things at that level, but then at the next place, maybe you learn another framework rather than learn the underlying technologies. And JavaScript is getting to the point now where it's just really it has a lot of the gaps that were there in ES5 are now starting to fill out really well.
Well, yeah, especially even with dependency injection, because now ES6 has a native module loader, right? So no more using patterns to, encapsulate or create these AMD modules. It's built into the language now, right? So, but that said, like I think this is not a new problem, and for me, like this started with jQuery, where people were learning jQuery before JavaScript, right? So, ultimately, I mean, I think can we maybe agree, because I think frameworks are extremely useful, but like any tool, it's at the hand of the user, right? Like how effective that person can be. And so, like, yes, you have a lot of people who have maybe they don't have a license to drive, but they're driving, right? So, and I think that same mentality is kind of creeping into the software development.
I think the key there is if you're a new person and you're trying to figure out whether you should use a framework or not for JavaScript. So this is tough because I would like to say that the answer is use the framework when you know you need it. But the problem is, again, like we were talking about earlier, it's like for the beginner, like the framework is a way for them to do these things that they couldn't have figured out how to do without it. So that's like absolute beginners are at this extremely tough spot where it's like I really don't think that you should be using frameworks because you don't know what you're getting yourself into. You don't know why you're using it, and you're not going to be able to figure out what's going wrong when something does go wrong, and you're going to use it wrong, and then your company is going to pay me to come in and do performance analysis, and I'll have to fix that for everybody. But like it's hard to, it's just a hard position to be in as a beginner. In JavaScript. I think it also goes back to maybe because we're all self-taught, and it's hard to figure out like what's the learning path that you should go on, and that's totally missing.
Yeah, I found too, like now that I'm in larger companies, like later in my career, I found two of the biggest things that are hard to scale are communication and discovery, and that's not just a JavaScript thing, right? But like, how do you communicate across teams at a large scale and make it effective? And how do you find things? Because a lot of times what will happen, the problems are, I'll create a module and it'll do this thing, and I've spent a sprint on it, lots of time, development time, and then somebody else on the team has already created something like that. But you didn't know because there was no canonical communication channel for that. And on a daily basis, if things are going wrong or if things are going right, praising the good things that happen as well as the bad, how do you keep in constant communication with your teammates?
So I think that you get more. I mean, that's a super hard problem, and that's like a CEO level problem. Is like when your organization gets to this level, how do we like make sure that everybody still knows what's going on? And trying to, like making your decision whether you want to keep everything flat or you do need to have structure or hierarchy. So that's a tough call. But I think in terms of code reusability, for me at least, what I've discovered is like the most libraries and modules are more reusable than like web components and these things in this type of environment. I think it's easier for people to discover tools that solve a specific problem that they're having and reuse that.
For now. No, but you shouldn't. I don't think you should componentize everything either.
Right.
There's things that are really good components work out well for, and there's things
absolutely.
that modules work out well for.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many opportunities for components with forms and things like this, which makes just so much sense.
So what about like you said sharing code a little bit with the modules. What about testing at scale and like continuous delivery?
I wish that I had any experience with that whatsoever. I've never had the privilege of working on a team that had it together enough to do something like that. And I think like that would be super amazing to have that, because that would solve one of the big communications problems like that you're mentioning, like seeing what other people are working on and making sure. But I just have never had that chance. And like as far as my testing goes, like I pretty much only write integration tests. I mean, that's basically all I ever get to on any project. I just try and get the most bang for my buck, and that seems to be the level. That
Even
makes
for
the most
like
sense.
modules that do something specific?
Oh, well, of course I write unit tests for things that are very complicated, functions that are very complicated. If I am having a hard time like figuring out how it should work and like making sure that if I can't like mentally figure out, like hold it all in my head what this particular thing is doing, then yeah, I'll write unit tests for that. But like mostly I get the most bang for my buck with integration tests.
It always shocks me that I think it's interesting how CI and everything sort of has come about lately. I mean, testing's been around for a while, and sort of knowing what that is in your branches and your builds is fine and dandy. But there is this. It's odd to me because for all the people who we use this, I see so many people who don't, because it is rather complicated for a team who's never done it to say, oh, you know what, we're just going to do this now. Let's fire. What are we firing up today as our CI server of choice? And there's a lot of products sort of around that now that try to simplify that to get people into that rhythm of doing things, but it's not necessarily one of those things that one you see in particularly smaller teams, and I've been in a lot of larger teams too who simply do not have it because they simply do not have the time and the hours. They have a system that works. Their system is stable for the way they work. People try to come in all the time and try to resolve the problem of not having the thing that's not going to resolve any problem for them, and it never gets done. Like it just people are like, no, we're not doing that. Well, why not? It's going to solve all your problems. We don't have a problem.
Exactly.
It's very much a cultural thing, though, right, Justin? I mean, it's like testing is a cultural thing. Like, you either buy into it as a company and as an engineering team, or you don't. The same thing with automation. I'm realizing, I'm an automation junkie, and it's like I love automating things and repetitive tasks. To me, it's like if I have to repeat this manually, then I'm just not going to do it because it's not enjoyable. But again, that's a cultural thing. It's
and
not.
That's what I have Z Shell and Perl for. So at that point, I'm pretty solid. But that's me personally.
That's why I learned Bash, honestly, right? Like.
Well, I think for a lot of front-end developers, it's hard to think about CI because you don't have much control over it. And if you're lucky enough to have a infrastructure team or a DevOps team, right, then it's probably done a certain way, and there's probably some hodgepodge things added on, and then now with mobile development, it adds a whole new way to think about continuous integration and delivery. So it's not an easy thing to solve, and I see companies constantly redoing this, and as a front-end developer, we really don't have much control over that. I can say, use Docker for all the things, and do this and do that, but the complexities are just so political usually, and like it's what I'm talking about.
So I think that it's hard to tie the what's the business value of doing continuous integration, right? And it's really hard to explain that to a business, and then sometimes actually there's not enough business value to justify the ridiculous like initial investment that you'd have to make into, especially for like an existing code base. I mean, I think that's why you're not seeing a lot of adoption.
Like Justin said, there's no problem that we're trying to solve. So why do I need to do this again?
Well, if you're a startup, right, then your continuous delivery time without that overhead is going to be, hey, let's just push it. All right, now deploy, done. Right, but if you have a large team of like 40 people touching this code base, continuous integration can solve a lot of bug issues.
Right.
Continuous delivery will get your stuff out to market. You can automated scripts to like push to the app stores. There's.
And I'm not against it. I'm just saying that
exactly.
With a product that's 15 years old, 10 years old, like, I don't know.
Agreed.
Like,
it's not for everything.
No, I think today, like, if you're spinning up something greenfield, I think that there is a case to be made that it is somewhat simpler to have some of these things at the start, because a lot of this is now much more available in a form that is an easier setup path.
But start as simple and flexible as you can. Don't try and create well, we need 500 tests. We need coverage for every
Sure.
single model and every single controller.
Totally agree.
Add a few tests.
Hey, I strive for 100% test coverage. I don't know about you guys,
Coverage
but
is nothing if your test.
my Istanbul coverage is usually looking very good for unit tests. Integration tests are another story.
If
But
my
test-
QA
test-
doesn't look at me cross-eyed, I'm fine. Like, it just,
Or if
you know,
you don't
as long as
have
QA is
QA.
not angry, yeah, you're just like, I'm like, oh, I made a mistake.
So we guys, we have to invite the Atlassian team here, like a few developers from there, because they have automation down to to a point where they, as like 5 or 6 engineers, are working on code bases that other companies would have like 4 times the number of engineers. So I think it's really interesting how you can leverage that to actually be more efficient and push more confidently, right? I mean, you hear Facebook like pushing code multiple times a day, like with confidence because of their unit test coverage,
Yeah, we had an episode with them. I missed it. I got to hear it though. Ralph Whitbeck and I
Nice.
forgot who else. We had 2 people from Atlassian talking about project management and Git.
Nice.
And it was really interesting. I wish I was actually on that one. We also had from Atlassian in Sydney area, we had Trey Shugart on Skate.js, and like he talked a little bit about the culture there too, which was really nice. Atlassian's a great company. I really like what they're
It seems
doing.
like a fun place to be an engineer. I mean, they really value the craft,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So as far as like a lot of things, once you have this code base that's out of control and trying to tackle it down, a lot of companies suffer and they just reach for the nearest, quick fix and band-aids. How do you handle when that sort of stuff happens? How do you handle performance, and security? Those are 2 really big ones that you usually are not proactive. It's usually like, oh my God, our site's down, we're losing money, fix this now.
Right. So I don't know. Help me narrow down this question a little bit more. Like, are we talking about like working with a really big legacy code base? And
Yeah, pretty much that's what I'm referring to. Because then, it starts out small, like Justin said, and then eventually you have a Frankenstein Jenga puzzle that,
Well, I mean, the first thing you do
break something else.
the first thing you do with a the first thing you do with a legacy code base is you evaluate whether it's doing the job that it's supposed to do, and if it is, and that's the thing, most of the time it is, and so then you just have the pain of having to dive into and work with somebody else's code. So, I mean, in my experience, you guys probably agree with this, like, most of my job is reading with and working with other people's code. So I've just sort of resigned myself to that and figured out different ways of coping and dealing with that.
What kind of alcohol do you like?
Yeah, exactly. So like my strategy, my biggest strategy for that is I assume that they had the best intentions, and I always assume that they thought through what they were doing and that there was some reason for this. And if somebody leaves me a comment that explains why they did something, then I like jump up and down with joy, because that's literally all I could ask for is like at least explain why you did this, and then I won't judge how you did it.
It's such a great approach because you don't know the context behind that. There could have been this long history, like they had to do this person did this, this other thing, and you want to leave it as neat as possible, but you don't want to pull that piece out of the Jenga that knocks the whole thing down.
Yeah, because it begins to be so tempting when you see, somebody doing something a little bit off, like, or using state over here where it's like, why isn't this just, parameter in this function, something like this, and turns out, that's actually used in like 4 different places, and there's and it was for good reason because of these like downstream or upstream problems that made them do it in this particular way. And so like the key with that is, just working with the grain and like being okay with it being a little messy. And my code that I contribute to legacy code is not necessarily going to be like the most beautiful code that I've ever written, right? Because I'm constrained by what I'm working with, and being okay with that. So that's kind of how I work with it. And then eventually, if you're working with an old code base long enough, you get to know it well enough that then you could start, like, you'll know, like, when you understand it well enough that you could, like, yank out a certain part and start to actually refactor and change things. But that's basically what the whole process is like getting the whole thing loaded into your brain like it was with the previous developer. Trying to do that without hating them at the same time, and like trying to also make progress for your client or your boss, like, while also learning this new code base.
I love deleting code. That's my favorite thing.
Oh
When you get
yeah,
to that
it's
point
so satisfying
and-
when you figure out how to do that.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's like the best.
Well, it's like a puzzle piece just fell in place in your mind, and you're like, oh, we don't need this, and then you could just delete. Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think deleting code, green tests, and automating menial tasks, I think those are definitely like in order of like what feels good for me. But speaking of which, there's a really great article by Martin Fowler on the same approach that you just mentioned, Sean. If, just kind of like how do you refactor a legacy application? I mean, you can't just stop, pause, right, and tell a business, we'll see you in 3 months. We're rewriting this piece of whatever. And so it's called strangling your application. So you basically just like
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's like you're basically, let's say it has like 10 modules, right? So you're kind of replacing each one at a time, and then and the pattern is like you're kind of killing your legacy application by strangulation because you're slowly replacing it from within itself, right? But while still delivering business value. So you're not pausing for 3 months or 6 months to rewrite everything.
My only caveat with that is, like, I think that most people are, when they do a rewrite with legacy code, it's not, they'll say that it's because, and probably even feel this way, that it's because it's terrible and it needs to be redone and they're doing it completely wrong. But really what the most value you get out of doing the rewrite is you actually then, while you're rewriting, you actually learn why it was the way it was to begin with. Like, you're actually learning the code base then. So most people do rewrites as a way to, like, learn the code base. So I guess that's a good idea to do it one small piece at a time. I mean, another thing is, like, you don't even need to rewrite. Sometimes the code that they wrote turns out it's just fine. Like, it's doing its job. It's not the way you would have done it, but you could be okay with it. Give it a couple of integration tests.
Or better variable names, like even just renaming variables and methods sometimes, and just cleaning up the code.
Discover why, leaving comments explaining why, things like this, drawing pictures, like that's kind of how I do it.
Just no passive-aggressive comments, and always have semicolons.
Yes, a semicolon person. I approve.
So we're a bit close to time. I think we might be 1 minute over. But is there anything that you'd like to add to this? How can people find you? What's your Twitter handle?
So you can find me planningforaliens.com. That's my main shtick. Yeah, and my Twitter is sfiorito, SFIORITTO. So nobody's gonna be able to spell that, but yeah. So that's where you can find me.
All right. Well, this has been episode number 95. Did you have one more thing to say?
Oh, I was just going to ask him if any tips or resources on, like, kind of how to, anything else that you'd like to add, just on resources on how to maybe detox of frameworks, framework detoxing?
So I've been writing about it on my
blog,
my website recently. Okay. Yeah, so planningforaliens.com/blog, and I'm going to continue to write about it there. Yeah, actually, if you just Google, like, why JavaScript development is crazy, you'll find that article. That's a good place to start, I think. Yeah, that's something I'm kind of passionate about. Is I feel really bad for beginners that are coming into JavaScript world and trying to figure out, like, their learning path, and so I feel there's a huge gap for people like that. So that's something that I'm working on, and also working on more material about, like, how do you structure JavaScript applications without a framework, like, if you're not doing that. So I think there's a pretty big gap, stuff like that. So that's what I'm going to be writing on and doing, like, in between client work. So.
All right.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. This has been episode number 95, Exploring JavaScript at Scale. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, guys.